Welcome back to the Spector Creative channel. I'm Scott Toy Guru Neitlich, and that is not Scott Toy Guru Neitlich. That is Maddie Collector, or Maddie Mattel, who incidentally was actually based on Van Wilder, but that's a whole other story. Maddie Collector was Mattel's premier adult action figure website that sold toys to adult collectors, people like you and me. And I had the absolute honor of running it for most of its life. I also got to hire people like Tim here, who was a 6'9" actor who could play Maddie Mattel at conventions because, we needed a really tall guy because I guess Maddie Collector is like 7 feet tall for some reason. Anyway, besides being a giant oversized character with a huge head at conventions, Maddie Collector was also a website. And this was a website to sell toys directly to the consumer, meaning we bypassed retail. And for a collector line, this is a really good thing. Retail is great for kid lines, but it has limitations because you are basically dependent on retail in order for a line to last and go deep into character selection. Retailers have to continually order product year after year after year, and if product doesn't perform, it gets delisted. But Maddie Collector, on the other hand, just depended on directly the adult collector. So as long as collectors were buying it, we could keep making it, which is why Maddie Collector lines, like Masters of the Universe Classic, was able to go so deep because there was no retail factor and we didn't have to earn our place at retail, if you will. And because of that, Masters of the Universe Classics probably has one of the deepest character selections of any toy line. Well, G.I. Joe and Star Wars squash it, of course, but it's doubtful that there will be another He-Man line that will go that deep. And it wasn't just Masters of the Universe, of course, that was sold on Maddie Collector, but there were a lot of DC toys as well in various scales and different styles, both animated and movie, and as well as the 6-inch line. And Ghostbusters was a big part of it as well, doing different figures in different scales, as well as prop replicas. But there were a few other brands that were on Maddie Collector too that don't get talked about as much. One of them is Cars. We did some specific scale cars from Pixar's Cars for John Lasseter. He actually really wanted this specific scale, and we used Maddie to do that. And another line that had kind of a one-off item was Voltron. And a lot of people will be like, wait, Voltron? Mattel did Voltron toys? I don't even think I remember that. Well, that's because pretty much all of Mattel's Voltron toys came out on Maddie Collector, and I'll go into that. So the crown jewel of the Maddie Collector Voltron toys was this guy, who was actually made up of 5 different SKUs, which were actually made up of 10 different products. So let's kind of get into that. It was a bit of a logistical nightmare, but it's still one of the coolest and biggest Voltron Defender of the Earth action figures of all time. And I'm really proud of getting to work on parts of it because I didn't work on all of it. And in fact, I worked on very little of it, even though I was the brand manager for Maddie Collector. And let me explain kind of how all that worked. Because this toy was a little bit of a logistic nightmare, and it was that for quite a few reasons. And for all of the issues that went into producing it, it actually came out really nicely. So let's go back to 2010-2011 and tell a story of Mattel and love and the choice that Mattel had to make. What do I mean by the choice? Well, Mattel, like most other major corporations and most Fortune 500 companies, wants to have what's thought of as a diversified brand portfolio, meaning lots of different brands that are sort of to different types of consumers. The consumer for American Girl isn't necessarily the same type of consumer for WWE action figures. So, Mattel was looking at 2 different properties to acquire to further diversify their boys action group. And both of them were going under a renaissance. One was Thundercats, and the other was Voltron. Both of them were properties from the 80s that were now being redone for, quote-unquote, today's generation. I know that gets said all the time, constantly, like every time a concept is refreshed and rebooted. And while both of them definitely had their pros and cons, and both of them were very toyetic in terms of having teams and having signature weapons and having things that work really well and proven in the action figure aisle, both of them went through a lot of review process. And in the end, it was pretty much decided that as cool as Thundercats was, it was too close to He-Man. In other words, Mattel already had kind of a barbarian sword property. And getting Thundercats just meant they were doubling down. because, yes, they are different, and ironically, Mattel eventually did do Thundercats toys very briefly, but that's a video for another time. And if you're looking at a fully diversified portfolio, even though He-Man and Lion-O and She-Ra kind of look like they could all hang out together, that was actually sort of the point, because they could hang out together. Voltron, on the other hand, doesn't really hang out with He-Man. Voltron is a very different type of property. It's based on space and robots and transforming lion robots. So it was felt that this was different enough that it was a better choice going after Voltron versus Thundercats. So Thundercats was passed, it went to Bandai, and Mattel went after Voltron and acquired it for their boys' action team, or group, if you will, that made all the action figures, and a brand management team was assigned to it. And the idea was the new show was going to be the jumping off point to a really big new retail line for kids. So kids of today, new generation, could see themselves as the pilots of these awesome lions. And of course, there'd be the nostalgia factor for the adult collector who would fondly remember all of the figures and the animation and the property from the 1980s. And I'm not going to go into a whole thing about how the property was really just, kit bashed from multiple different animes from Japan. That's a whole other YouTube video, and I'm sure you could easily find that. But the idea of making something old new again for this generation, is done over and over again. And the new cartoon looked like it had everything that would be great for selling toys. Transforming robot lions, everyday heroes that worked together as a team and showed teamwork and, all of the, advantages to that. Now, as far as the adult collector was concerned, of course there was a nostalgia play. Back in the 80s, there were quite a few Voltron toys. And, well, actually, there were many, many Voltron toys. So the kids bought the Voltron toys in the 80s. The idea was that kids would buy the Voltron toys in the 2010s. And a whole line was designed for retail, and it was shown off at several conventions, including San Diego Comic-Con, showing off the lions and how they would come together to make the Voltron robot. And it was quite an impressive-looking toy, but it never shipped to retail. And basically, that's because the show didn't do well, and retail said, hey, we're not interested anymore. But a lot of design work went in. It was a full brand team that was working on this, just like WWE, just like Max Steel, just like Batman. So there was a lot of people, designers, packaging, legal, and there were some great concepts that really played up the fact that in this new iteration of Voltron, different lions could be the center. And there was a whole thing where that was going to work in the toys as well, and honestly, it was pretty cool. But unfortunately, when the show doesn't do well, retailers tend to back off, and it never happened. So there were some SKUs that happened, and ironically, those were only the collector ones. The first was a 6-inch Voltron that was kind of scaled for Marvel Legends or Motu Classics, Black Series Star Wars, which didn't exist at the time. But it was basically a super articulated 6-inch Voltron that came with 2 different versions of his sword. It wasn't a giant, huge robot, but it was cool because it could hang out with Batman and Spider-Man and He-Man on your shelf in your 6-inch collection. The scale obviously being off, but hey, imagination. It was fun. So the other item that was done was going to look at the heritage of Voltron and sort of the 2 major Voltrons that were from the 80s. So, okay, well, there weren't just 2. There were obviously a lot of Voltrons from the 80s, and, more so if you're going to start to get into vehicle Voltron and, all the stuff that actually was in Japan that was not in the US. But the 2 major US brands was the Pinoche Palace version of Voltron, which allowed pilots to go into the lions and pilot them as vehicles. And it came together, and it was huge, and he had his sword and his shield, and the helmets came off, and it was kind of the ultimate Voltron toy you could have as a child, which of course I didn't have. I had the one from Matchbox, which actually was one of my favorite toys, and I so regret that I don't have it anymore, even though I know it's been reissued. I missed this one. It was shorter than the other Voltron, and the lions still came apart, but it was smaller that the pilots, there were no pilots. They couldn't go in the lions. You just had the lions. But man, did I love this toy. It was heavy. It was all made of die cast. I mean, there was some plastic, but man, talk about a die cast. I mean, when die cast toys were huge, like with Transformers in the 80s, I mean, this thing weighed a ton. Maybe not literally a ton, but it was heavy. And all of the lions kind of had personality and did sort of had like neat little action features in addition to the transformation. And it was durable. I mean, you could, drop this thing on the ground and it was gonna stay intact, or you could smash someone over the head. No, you really should not smash someone over the head with it. Never mind, I take that back. But yeah, it could be a weapon, I suppose, if used in that way. All right, I better stop saying this before I get sued. So the new Voltron that Mattel was making, the team looked heavily at both versions. I kind of stepped in since it was going to be sold on Matty Collector. I said, hey, do you guys want me to be involved in this? Can I help out? I do know the adult collector market. And the brand team was like, yeah, we got this one. I mean, we know you're going to handle all the sales logistics and we're going to get the revenue, but that's, we can do this. So I had very limited input into the design of this toy. I do think they did a great job. I'm just don't want to take credit for what they did, because I wasn't unlike Motu Classics or Justice League or the Ghostbuster toys on Matty. I was not the marketing manager who oversaw production and design. That was the retail Voltron team did, because this was going to be seen as an item that would reinvigorate the fan base to tee up the interest in the new show. But with the new show not doing well and the retail line getting canceled, this kind of became the only toy that the Voltron retail team worked on, ironically. And it was sold on Matty Collector. Now, it did, as I said, it played up the nostalgia for the original show, and it was going to have pilots that could fit into the Lions, just like the Bosch toy, not the Matchbox toy. And you were going to use a little key that could also work as a figure stand to open up the lion. All of the lions had sort of locking jaws, and the arms and legs were spring-loaded so that they could pop out. I remember very distinctly Brandon Sapinski saying this, magically. Like, it had this cool action feature where the arms and legs would pop out. Now, I did speak up, and I really pushed to do things that were an homage to the Matchbox toy as well. Like the Yellow Lion had those opening cheek cannons, whatever you want to call it. I don't know, but I just so fondly remember pulling them out and having the Yellow Lion be able to like shoot lasers out of his like attached cheek things that never showed up on the show. But they were toy memories of mine. What can I say? Or the Blue Lion, where the kind of ears and skull cap, for lack of a better word, you could pull that up for reasons, I don't know, but you could. And again, it was just like one extra little cool feature. And I thought it'd be great to put this on the Matty, the Mattel version, but unfortunately, again, I was kind of sidelined, and they're like, well, thanks for participating, but we got this. So I did have some issues. As much as I did love this toy, I thought that the pop-out leg feature was not, well, basically it was creating like a kid feature, which is, a pop-out feature aimed at collectors. And I kind of think when you do that, you're creating what's called a sofa bed toy. It's not quite a sofa, it's not quite a bed, it's not quite a kid toy, it's not quite a collector toy. You're basically taking a kid feature and putting it into a collector toy. But I have to know my place in my circle. I don't control everything yet. And, I respected the team that they were going to design this. I wanted highly articulated legs, basically on ball joints. But I was kind of sidelined and had to sort of watch this toy be created, even though I was going to handle all of the logistics of selling it. So it's like I didn't get to do any of the fun part, but I got to do all of like the tough work, which was organizing the logistics of the sale. But hey, Mattel paid me a paycheck, and I was grateful for that, and that was perfectly fine. I don't want to come across as like bitter or anything, just noting that, my suggestions were, shall we say, overlooked. So the sword had a particular issue that it came with two different versions, a sort of flame on and flame off version of the sword, as well as the star shield. And the issue was that because of the height of Voltron, the sword had to be a certain height as well. And this put it into the role play category, where the sword could technically be held by a child and really just be a role play sword. Well, Mattel didn't have role play rights to Voltron. So a creative workaround was created by including a stand to hold the sword, so that if you didn't want Voltron holding the sword, you could put it in a stand, and the stand would almost permanently lock. That was required by the way the license was, so to prevent it from being a role play toy. All right, and then the figures, of course, were really cool. They had two different heads, helmeted and not helmeted. And the way it was sold, and here's sort of the logistics, was, well, there were like 10 different SKUs. So you had, and multiple versions of SKUs. So you had the black lion, the lead lion, and the lead pilot, which were two different SKUs bundled together on Matty Collector. And then you had the arms, which were smaller than the black lion, as well as the pilot, which was a separate SKU. And then you had the leg lions, which again was a separate SKU because the size difference. So you had arms, legs, and the middle of the body. So you were dealing with like a lot of different sizes, price points. They were all bundled with the pilot. To say it was a logistical like cluster fluke is barely scratching the surface. But we managed to pull it off because all of the lions came with their pilot. They were bundled together. They were sold day of, and if you could subscribe and get all of them, if you signed up for, I think we called it Club Lion Force, was it, I believe? I don't know, memory fades. And again, I'm really proud of how they came out. And I remember one of the things the fans had was the issue that we painted on the glare from the lighting effect, if you will, on the shoulders. But that was in the style guide, which is why it was done. So, painting via a lighting effect. There's a whole video on that you can see on my channel. And, of course, it meant creating a lot of different packages because every lion type needed its own package, arms, body, and legs. And then we needed a package for the pilots. And then we needed a package for the subscription-only item. And this was one of the only things that I was actually involved in. I was sort of called back from the sidelines and said, okay, Scott, we do know, adult collectors, what could we do as a subscription bonus item? So I suggested doing Sven, which was the alternate pilot for the Black Lion, as a whole issue where, he either gets killed or gets sick in the first episode, depending on if you watch it in English or Japanese. But the point is, he showed up very briefly before mysteriously disappearing. And the idea was to do him as a figure, which was just going to be a new head, and release him on a card that would be reminiscent of the vintage cards that came out in the 80s. And so this was my one contribution to the Voltron toy. Now, had the Matty Collector item done better, we had a second year plan where we were going to do more figures, because we were really looking at which figures were released in the 80s on this card and doing a lot of the bad guys, doing, alternate characters, some of the, the allies or guides. But unfortunately, it didn't meet sales expectations, and with the show not doing well enough to justify retailers to carry the kid line, it basically meant that this was a one-and-done project, which is why Mattel only did one Voltron thing. I mean, I know it was like 10 SKUs plus a subscription figure, and then there was that Comic-Con 6-inch figure, but with the new show underperforming and the bulk of the work that the Voltron team was doing was on the retail line. This was, the whole Matty item was kind of like a side project, maybe representing 10% of the total amount of work they did on the line. So 90% of the work they did never made it to market, which is always a shame, but that's kind of the way it is in the toy industry. And when a show just underperforms, management will pull the plug and say, all right, before we do that huge capital investment, stop everything. If there's no show and no content, or if the show doesn't perform well, retailers don't want to take the risk. And that is why only one item wound up shipping for the whole Voltron team that was formed. It's like, Mattel had their own Voltron team. And except it was, marketing, design, packaging, legal. It wasn't, red lion, green lion, blue lion, polka dot lion, etc. It was a really cool toy, and I'm looking at it right now in my office. I absolutely love it. So, way to go. And for those of you who have it, hey, you have an awesome toy. I hope you enjoyed this look behind the scenes at the Matty Collector Voltron toy, the one-and-done figure from the Voltron license that we got to do. If you have questions, comments, leave them below. I always answer back. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.